a warm night in Las Vegas, a room full of powerful people gathered to be entertained. They came dressed in confidence, in money, in influence. They believed they were untouchable. What none of them expected was that a single moment of quiet humiliation would expose something far more dangerous than anger. It would expose dignity. And dignity, when defended openly, has a way of unsettling even the most powerful men in the room. In the early 1960s, Las Vegas was still learning how to sell its myth. Neon lights promised freedom, music promised glamour, and the stage promised escape. But behind the illusion, the city operated on rules that were never written down. Who you were mattered. Who you knew mattered more. And for some people, respect was never guaranteed, no matter how talented they were. For black performers, this reality was impossible to ignore. They were celebrated on stage and tolerated off it, applauded in public and diminished in private. They learned early that survival often meant restraint. Smile, perform, do not challenge the room. One man understood that better than most: Sammy Davis Jr. By the time Sammy walked onto that stage, he was already a legend. A singer, a dancer, an actor, someone who could command silence without raising his voice. But talent did not protect him from prejudice. According to people who worked in the entertainment circuit at the time, Sammy lived with a constant awareness that his success rested on fragile ground. One complaint, one offended guest, one moment interpreted the wrong way, and doors could close. So Sammy learned discipline. He learned to read rooms quickly, to sense shifts in energy, to continue performing even when discomfort crept in. That night was no different, until it was. The showroom was full, every table occupied. The front rows reserved for men who carried influence, some openly, some quietly. There were businessmen, political figures, and individuals whose authority was understood rather than announced. People close to the scene later recalled that performers always knew which tables required caution. This was one of them. Sammy stepped into the spotlight. The band began, and almost immediately the room responded. Conversation softened. Movement slowed. For a few minutes, hierarchy disappeared. There was only music, only presence, only a man doing exactly what he had trained his entire life to do. But not every pair of eyes was focused on the performance. At one of the front tables sat a man known for control rather than admiration. Witnesses later described him as attentive but not engaged, observant but not impressed. He spoke quietly to those around him. They laughed, not loudly, not disruptively, just enough to signal entitlement. Sammy noticed, but Sammy continued, because reacting was dangerous, and ignoring was safer. Then came the moment no one could ignore. A glass was lifted. Not in celebration, not in appreciation. A careless movement followed. Liquid splashed forward. Not dramatic, not explosive. Subtle. Enough to reach the stage. Enough to be seen. Enough to send a message. This was not enthusiasm. This was ownership. The music hesitated, not because the band lost rhythm, but because the atmosphere shifted. The room felt smaller, tighter. Everyone understood what had just happened. This was not part of the show. This was humiliation disguised as accident. Sammy paused, only briefly. People close to him later said moments like this forced a calculation every black performer of that era knew intimately. Do you react and risk escalation, or do you continue and protect your future? Sammy adjusted himself. He prepared to go on. That is when something unexpected happened. Someone else stepped into the light. Dean Martin was not scheduled to appear, but he walked onto the stage anyway. Not hurried, not dramatic, just present. He stood next to Sammy, not in front of him, not behind him, beside him. Those who witnessed it later described the moment as quiet but unmistakable. A line had been drawn without a word being spoken. Dean did not immediately address the table. He looked at Sammy, then at the audience, then calmly toward the source of the disruption. What mattered most was not what he said, but what he did. He refused to let the moment pass. Dean Martin understood the environment. He knew the unspoken rules of Las Vegas. He knew who held power. He knew what challenging it could cost. But he also understood something else. Silence can be permission. And that night, silence would have meant agreement. By standing beside Sammy, Dean reframed the entire situation. This was no longer a performer being tested by a patron. This was a public question of dignity. And dignity, once questioned openly, demands an answer. Those familiar with the era later described the tension as immediate. The room was watching, not for violence, but for response. The man at the table now faced a choice: continue and turn a subtle insult into a public confrontation, or stop and accept that control had shifted. This was not about apology. It was about acknowledgement. After a pause that felt longer than it was, the disruption ended. No grand gesture followed, no confrontation, just an understanding that the moment had reached its limit. The music resumed. Sammy sang, and something in the room had changed. People who attended similar performances later said that the difference was impossible to miss. There was no anger in his voice, no defiance, only certainty. When the song ended, the audience stood, not out of obligation, but recognition. They had witnessed something rare. That night did not dismantle power structures. It did not end discrimination. And it did not rewrite history. But it mattered. Because humiliation had not gone unanswered. Not through aggression, not through chaos, but through presence. Years later, Sammy Davis Jr. would speak about moments when dignity felt fragile, and how knowing someone was willing to stand beside him altered how he carried himself afterward. It was not about being saved. It was about being seen. Dean Martin never spoke publicly about that night. People close to him later suggested he never viewed it as courageous. For him, it was loyalty. And loyalty, when practiced quietly, often leaves the deepest mark. Las Vegas would continue to evolve. The lights would grow brighter. The stories would grow louder. But for those who were there, that night remained memorable for a different reason. Because power depends on people believing they are isolated. And that night, someone proved they were not. In environments built on intimidation, the most disruptive act is often the calmest one. Standing beside someone, refusing to look away, choosing dignity when silence feels safer. Some moments do not change the world. They change the people inside them. And sometimes, that is enough.